Imagine you're camping in the snow and suddenly you come across these two metallic cylinders. And within about a 1 meter radius of these containers, there is no snow and the ground is actually steaming. What would you do? Three men actually had to make this decision in 2001 and it did not end well for them. Hello and welcome to Radioactive History. This is a series I did over on my TikTok that I am now continuing over here. So welcome. And today we're going to be talking about the Lia Incident or Lia Incident. So this radiological accident took place on December 2nd, 2001, when 3 villagers discovered 2 orphan radiation sources near the Enguri Dam in the country of Georgia. The sources were unlabeled radioisotope thermoelectric generator cores, or RTGs, that were unlabeled, improperly dismantled, and left behind from the Soviet era. This is what the generators look like normally, but as I said, these were improperly dismantled, so the only thing that remained was the unlabeled core itself, which looked like this. So what actually happened during this incident is these 3 men from Lia had actually driven near the dam in search of firewood, despite the snowy and nearly impassable conditions, and actually ended up discovering these canisters. Oddly enough, they would discover that there was no snow within about a 3-foot radius of these canisters, and the first man who picked up the canister immediately dropped it because of how hot it was. Now, at some point, the men decided it was too late to turn back because it was too snowy and cold and getting dark and whatnot, so they decided to just camp out for the night. And how convenient that they just discovered these 2 new heat sources. So the men decide to relocate these sources a little bit away and make their camp around them, actually moving them into their little outcrop shelter. They ate dinner and had a little bit of vodka and experienced vomiting symptoms about 3 hours after initially discovering the cylinders, which would be the first symptoms of acute radiation sickness. The vomiting would become more severe and last throughout the night, which would mean that the 3 men would not get very much sleep that night. Despite this, the men used the cylinders to keep them warm at night, positioning them against their backs as close as 10 centimeters or about 4 inches. The next day, the men were loading wood into their truck with the sources hung from their back, although they experienced extreme exhaustion and only loaded about half the firewood that they initially intended, although they would return home later that evening. 2 days later, on December 4th, one of the men would visit a local doctor and explain his symptoms, although he would not mention the cylinders that he discovered, so the doctor assumed he was drunk and sent him on his way. Around December 15th, 2 of the men would develop itching and burning on the small of their backs where the radiation source had been the closest. A few of them also began to lose their voice, and around this time, the men and their wives actually began to discover that they all were sick with very, very similar symptoms. The wife and brother of one of the men actually reached out to the police, who advised that they all be hospitalized, so they actually were. All 3 men were finally admitted to the hospital on December 22nd, where it was determined that they had ARS, or acute radiation sickness. One of the men was released on January 23rd, 2002, as his illness was a lot less severe than the others, but the other 2 men remained in severe condition. Another of the men was sent to a medical biophysical center in Moscow, and the last villager was sent to Percy Medical Hospital in Paris. This patient was hospitalized for over a year and required extensive skin grafts, although he did eventually recover and was released from the hospital on March 18th, 2003. The patient that was sent to Moscow unfortunately was not so lucky. He had received large radiation exposure to his back as well as his heart and other vital organs. A large radiation ulcer developed on his upper left back, and despite intensive care, multiple surgeries, multiple rounds of antibiotics, and attempted skin grafts, nothing would heal the wound. The tuberculosis meant that his lung injury could not be properly treated, and past drug use further weakened his health. He unfortunately developed sepsis and died on May 13th, 2004, which was 893 days after his initial exposure. It is believed that this patient received between 21 and 37 grays directly to his left shoulder. Now, a full-body exposure of about 10 grays is believed to be 99% fatal, but obviously in this man's case, it was a lot higher of a radiation dose and a lot more localized to one area. So here is the estimated whole body doses in grays for each of the men. Patient D1-DN was the man who unfortunately passed away, although patient 2-MG actually received more radiation, which is one interesting thing. On December 29, 2001, they were able to successfully locate the canisters, and this is of course an image from the video that they took then. Although mostly due to bad weather, they weren't actually able to acquire the canisters until February 2nd to February 3rd of 2002. But they were able to successfully retrieve the canisters and move them to a permanent storing location without any other injuries or fatalities. So there were a few takeaways from this incident, the first of which was that the sources themselves were unlabeled so that the men couldn't have possibly known of the danger with which they were dealing with. Secondly, the illegal abandonment of the sources themselves, due to the Soviets dismantling and abandoning these sources and leaving them in the middle of the woods to be discovered to begin with. And then finally, their final report also stressed the importance of clinicians being able to identify what radiation overexposure looks like when people come into the hospitals. When someone comes in with acute radiation sickness symptoms, it's not acceptable for you to just tell them that they're drunk and send them on their way. In this case, proper treatment was delayed by 2 to 3 weeks because the doctors failed to recognize what was actually going on. Between the Soviet fall and the year 2006, there had been over 300 of these orphan radiation sources that had been recovered in Georgia, just in the country of Georgia alone. The abandonment of military stations in Georgia after the fall of the Soviet Union caused a lot of these radiation sources and these equipment to be completely forgotten about. So it just serves as yet another reminder of the importance of handling and also disposing of radioactive items. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to comment another radioactive history topic that I should cover next.